Kevin Rudd, welcome to 7:30.
Thanks for having me on the programme.
The Prime Minister is on his way to Beijing this weekend, and the US President is going to meet President Xi later this month. Does this mean that China is changing its relationship with the West?
Well, on the US-China relationship to start with, the Chinese have indicated a deep interest in trying to stabilise the relationship with Washington, and that's reciprocated. You've seen this pace of visits now involving National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, Secretary of the Treasury, the Secretary of Commerce, the Climate Change Special Representative, etc. And Wang Yi, in fact, arrived in this town at the end of last week, just as Prime Minister Albanese was winging his way back to Australia. Bottom line is, China sees value in stabilising the relationship, in large part because they know their economy is suffering from declining trade and declining foreign direct investment flows and portfolio investment flows, not just from the US, but around the world. So they have an interest in stabilising this relationship as well.
And just for the sake of our audience, Wang Yi, who you mentioned there, is the Chinese foreign minister. But let me ask you this question. Does this apparent change in the relationship mean that we should be less concerned about the prospects of war over Taiwan?
We need to have a discipline about ourselves, both as allies of the United States, and I know for a fact within the US system itself, of being able to advance both these propositions simultaneously. That is, stabilising the political, diplomatic, and where possible, the economic relationship, while at the same time remaining vigilant about the core fact that China, in its own language, is no longer a status quo power. It does seek to change existing realities in terms of Taiwan, the South China Sea, the East China Sea. So what we need to do is to embrace both these realities at the same time. Rebuild diplomacy, use it as effectively as we can, but understanding that the core strategic reality requires continued active deterrence. Responsibility for the US, responsibility for US allies as well, including Australia.
You already mentioned stabilising. The other word being used to describe this trip to Beijing is normalisation. What do those words actually mean? What do they mean for the Prime Minister's visit?
Well, stabilisation has been a core objective of the Prime Minister's government since its election, the overall China relationship. And if you look at the evolution over the last 18 months, you now have ministers talking to each other again. In fact, we'd had a huge ministerial freeze in both directions. You've had movement now on the core questions of China's efforts at economic coercion against Australia, barley, wine, etc., plus, of course, Cheng Lei's release, although we still have Yang Hengjun in prison in China itself. So these are the products of stabilisation and a more normal political and economic relationship. But there'll always be limits. It can never be a perfectly normal relationship because of the deep divisions which exist on questions of alliance with the United States, security policy and strategic policy. But we can go a long, long way in stabilising and bringing back about a more normal political and economic relationship.
So what would be a successful visit for the Prime Minister?
The fact that it's occurring is of itself significant on the 50th anniversary of the establishment of diplomatic relations and Gough Whitlam's first visit there back in 1973. I'm old enough to actually remember that as a kid. It was a big occasion. So the fact this is occurring in the fabric of other minister-to-minister contact is good in terms of stabilising the relationship. Secondly, the fact that Trade Minister Farrell and others have been hard at work in renormalising core elements of the economic relationship, that too steps forward in that direction. Beyond that, let's wait and see. I think it's quite wrong to set up artificial benchmarks in advance to create some artificial basis for, pass, fail, or somewhere in between. Certainly, I don't think that's helpful.
There's plenty of free advice for the Prime Minister in the Australian media, warning him not to be too acquiescent with China. But how important is it for him to get commitments on removing the remaining trade sanctions?
I can say that the Prime Minister Albanese is deeply realistic about where the overall Australia-China relationship fits within the fabric of our underlying alliance obligations to the United States. Remember, as I said before, China itself, through its own leadership, says it is not a status quo power. it does seek to retake Taiwan at some point in the future. It leaves open the possibility of doing so with military force. It has most recently challenged the Philippines in the so-called Second Thomas Shoal, and Australia has expressed solidarity with the Philippines. As I said, this is therefore two parts, or two, as it were, hands clapping within the overall relationship. We can't push one to one side as if it didn't matter. And I think getting the balance of this right is where the PM, the Foreign Minister and others are seeking to take the relationship, and so far with success.
Can there be stabilisation of our relationship with China as long as Australian Yang Henjun remains in prison in China?
You know, when I used to work in the embassy way back when, my job was to deal with human rights cases. So I'm acutely conscious of how these continue to come up and form part of the overall, as it were, fabric of the Australia-China relationship over the decades. So I think it would be unwise to simply expect on a particular day that Yang Hengjun is going to be released. Remember, we went through the same process over a long period of time with Cheng Lei. This is patient diplomacy, and Foreign Minister Penny Wong has been putting in huge efforts over a long period of time on both these cases, achieving success with one, but let's not put an arbitrary timeline on resolving the second. This is patient and continuing diplomacy, and it reminds me of decades past as well.
On the Middle East now, you signed a letter along with 5 former Australian Prime Ministers condemning Hamas's attacks on October the 7th and offering solidarity to Israel. Australia's already an ally of Israel. Why was the letter necessary?
I listened very carefully to what Mike Burgess, the Director General of the Australian Security Intelligence Organisation, ASIO, had to say recently about his concerns about radicalisation and polarisation within the Australian community. So I judged it useful to join with former Prime Ministerial colleagues in putting out a clear statement to all within the Australian community, whether you are Jewish or Muslim, whether you're Israeli or Palestinian, that it was quite critical that as a nation we say, former Prime Ministers, Labor and Liberal, that there is no place for polarisation, for radicalisation, for division within our Australian community. Those concerns should be left way back at home. That's a large part of our motivation, and beyond that, of course, the appalling loss of civilian life, both by Israelis and innocent Palestinian lives as well. That formed the basis of this statement.
Kevin Rudd, thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be with you.